All right, I think we're right at noon, so let's get started. And welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Reineman. I'm your St. Johns River Keeper, and welcome to our new webinar series, the Watershed Watch Chats. It is our mission to defend and restore the St. Johns River, its springs and its tributaries. And it's a huge watershed. It's more than 8,800 square miles. And for us to do this important work, we have to work with many citizens and many partners. And so we're very happy to be here today with one of our fantastic partners, 1,000 Friends of Florida. And the topic for today's chat is the 2021 legislative review, specifically focusing on important issues in Central Florida and the St. Johns River. As I mentioned, it's our mission to defend the river, and we do that work through investigating pollution issues, advocacy for policy solutions, seeking solutions. We want to make sure when we're complaining about threats that we have solutions to overcome those threats, educating the public, raising awareness, and engaging in involvement. It's going to take all of us working together to make a difference. And so we want to make it easy for us to partner, engage on these important issues. 1,000 Friends of Florida has been saving special places and building better communities since 1986. And so we're very happy to be here with them today. They are the state's leading not-for-profit smart growth advocacy organization. And if you're not familiar with them, I think by the end of this, you'll see why they're so good at what they do. So we welcome them. Next slide. And so we have a lot of speakers, so we're going to jump right into it. And what I'm going to do is introduce them up front, then turn it over, and then we'll open up they will just go one after the other. And then we'll open up the floor for questions where you can raise your hand or put them in the chat afterwards. So we're very proud to have the president of 1,000 Friends today, Paul Owens, outreach director, Haley Bush, y'all can wave, and then policy and planning director, Jane West, and then our own St. Johns River Keeper Middle Basin coordinator, Gabby Melch. So with that, let's just look here at the Middle Basin. This is the entire St. Johns River watershed. The river begins in Indian River County and it flows north more than 310 miles. And so it's a huge watershed. The Middle Basin actually begins where the Econ-Waxahachie meets the St. Johns River in Osceola, Orange, and I'm forgetting a county, and Seminole counties, and then it flows northward into Lake and Volusia counties. And so this is an important area for us to make sure that we're working together to give this part of the river a voice, but also understanding how it fits in to the greater watershed health of the St. Johns River. Next. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker from 1,000 Friends, Jane West, the Policy and Planning Director. Take it away, Jane.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to kind of just do a very brief recap on some of the pending growth management legislation that we're going to be keeping an eye on. And I've culled these slides so that they're really kind of focused in on this Northeast regional area, the St. Johns River Basin. These bills all have statewide significance, but I think these are bills that you need to be paying attention to. So if we can just jump right in, that would be great. The first bill is SB 62. This is an awful bill, quite frankly. It seeks to dismantle all of Florida's 10 regional planning councils. The regional planning councils do amazing work. Unfortunately, this bill is sponsored by Senator Jennifer Bradley, a Republican in Northeast Florida. And if you go to the next slide, the reason we are so concerned about this bill is because regional planning councils serve to do a lot of collaboration, not only with local governments, but with businesses as well. And they help solve problems on a transportation level, regional resiliency. They deal with brownfields. In the Northeast Florida Regional Planning Council in particular is renowned for their fantastic technical staff experience on dealing with flooding mitigation in Northeast Florida, as well as sea level rise and adaptation and resiliency issues that are all really critical for this entire region. So we really would hate for this bill to continue. The good news is that it doesn't have a House counterpart. And so hopefully it will kind of die in the committee phase. Next slide, please. One bill that we are very supportive of is Senate Bill 514. There we go, which is a resiliency bill. And this actually has a House counterpart as well now, House Bill 315, sponsored by Lamarca. But Senator Ray Rodriguez, a Republican from Lee County, initially filed the Senate version. This bill is great. It's long overdue, but basically it establishes a statewide Office of Resiliency within the Executive Office of the Governor. It creates a statewide sea level rise task force. And that task force needs to specify the function of the consensus baseline projections for sea level rise. You can't have those projections until you first establish a baseline. And so we don't have that yet on a statewide basis, if you can believe it or not. So this task force is tasked with doing that. And it requires the ERC, the Environmental Regulation Commission, to take action on the task force recommendations. That's probably our only beef with this bill, is that ERC hasn't met in a very long time, well over a year. And so there is a little bit of concern that, these task force recommendations are just going to be punted into a black hole, so to speak. So that's our only concern with the bill. A similar, if not identical bill like this was filed last legislative session, and it did not pass. So hopefully we will have better luck this year. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 1247 and the House counterpart HB 487 deal with small scale development amendments. Currently, you can make a comprehensive plan amendment change on a very fast track basis. If it's 10 acres or less, it's called the small scale plan amendment. And this bill would seek to expand that to 50 acres being the threshold for that. And that's really problematic. 50 acres is a lot of land. It's going to have significant land use impacts, and we need to not fast track those plan amendments. They still need to be subjected to, quite frankly, the fairly nominal review at the state level by the Department of Economic Opportunity. So we do oppose this bill. Next slide. And finally, Senate Bill 1194 and the House counterpart HB 57. This is a very big, complex, fast-moving transportation bill, and it contains a lot of information in it. We are monitoring it only for one particular thing, and that's towards the end of the bill. It seeks to define borrow pit as the excavation of surface resources and not put it within the purview of currently the mining statutes that have more regulatory teeth. So basically you can excavate soil, sand, and clay. And as long as you're just removing it by dump trucks with no additional processing, it's not going to be subjected to that current mining criteria. So we're just watching this. Right now it's just a definition. So there are a lot of moving parts, like I said. So we haven't taken a position on this yet. We're just monitoring. And Paul will go next and explain the difference between how we monitor and take a position on bills. So with that, I will hand it over to our president, Paul Owens. Thank you.
And Paul, before you jump in, I know there is some borrow pit activity in the Middle Basin area. So if that's something you're concerned about, be sure and reach out to Gabby as we're monitoring some situations there in the Middle Basin. I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. And Shannon, if you wouldn't mind, if we can back up one there we go. I wanted to mention this. I provide this disclaimer when I'm talking about the bills that we monitor and then the bills that we actually take a position on. During the legislative session, there are usually upwards of 2,000 bills introduced during the legislative session. The ones we end up following a few dozen, which is a small fraction of that total, but it pretty much fills up our bandwidth to follow with our small staff, to follow a few dozen bills during the session. And the ones that we follow are ones that are tied to our mission of promoting statewide planning and growth management. We're also particularly interested in bills that may impinge or reinforce home rule when it's related to growth management or conservation. We're interested in statewide land, water protection, and conservation. And finally, transportation bills. We've been very active. We were very active a couple of years ago on the debate, during the debate over the MCORS toll road network, and we continue to follow that closely. There's some legislation that's pending on MCORS, including a major bill that was just dropped today that we're starting to analyze. Now, we don't take positions on every bill that we track, because some of the bills, even though we're following them, don't necessarily address our core interests. Some of them are a mix of good and bad, and some of them are moving targets. They're going to change during the legislative process. Okay, next slide, Shannon. So I'm going to be talking about conservation policy, and that's really influenced in Tallahassee by two things. One is by funding, which comes in one bill, the budget bill, and the other is by legislative policy, and that can be in multiple bills. I'm going to start with the governor's budget proposal for the next fiscal year starting on July 1st. And the governor introduced his budget proposal at the beginning of this month. One of the things he did was he included, despite the constraints on the budget, he did include a third $625 million installment of funding for Everglades restoration and water quality improvement. Now, the biggest chunk of this is $473 million for Everglades projects. The governor tends to, when it comes to funding, he tends to weight it kind of heavily toward the Everglades and South Florida, and less so toward Central and North Florida, despite all the environmental resources and assets in Central and North Florida. This installment also includes $100 million for a range of projects, including septic to sewer conversions or upgrades, improvements to wastewater treatment facilities, and stormwater system upgrades. These are all important because they're all major sources of nutrient pollution to waterways, whether it's the St. John's or natural springs, or even our underground water supply. He's also proposed $45 million to reduce nutrient pollution in waterways through green infrastructure or land conservation. Let's go to the next slide. There are some additional items he has proposed. One of the most significant is something called the Resilient Florida program that he's unveiled for this year. This would be over 4 years, a total of $1 billion, addressing grants to address sea level rise, stronger storms, and flooding associated with climate change. The way he is proposing to fund this is through bonds that would be repaid by a portion of the tax revenue that comes from real estate transactions. Interestingly enough, although there's been a big drop off in tax revenue from sales tax, the documentary stamp tax, which is associated with real estate transactions, is still quite strong. The real estate market is strong in Florida right now, despite the economic disruption from the pandemic. The governor's proposing $50 million for springs restoration. He and his supporters tend to tout that, but it's important to remember that this is what the law dictates has to be invested. A law that was passed a few years ago called the Legacy Act dictates has to be spent on springs restoration every year. So it's good to spend on springs. It'd be even better to spend more because there's a lot to be done on springs. He's proposing $32 million for infrastructure improvements in our parks, and just $50 million for Florida Forever, which is half what was approved, what he proposed and was approved last year, and a fraction of where it's been historically. Let's go to the next slide. 1000 Friends strongly believes that land conservation should remain a priority, even in a tight budget. Our Florida 2070 report, which we released a few years ago, predicted that without more aggressive land conservation in Florida, a third of the state would be paved over in the next half century. There are all kinds of benefits for Florida from land conservation. Most importantly for this discussion, in natural land naturally cleanses runoff, nutrient polluted runoff, removes the nutrients, helps protect our waterways and our water supply. It protects valuable land from being lost forever to sprawling development. It maintains the recreation that we all cherish, not only Floridians, but the tourists who flock here. It's a natural protection against flooding and the impacts of climate change. It maintains our agricultural economy. It preserves habitat for wildlife, and it buffers against the spread of diseases from animals to people, which is certainly important to think about as we are dealing with this pandemic. And the funding comes from those real estate taxes for land conservation that I mentioned. So it's not, it is not taking away funding from other priorities in the budget that are dealt with through general revenue, like education and healthcare. Let's go to the next slide. So our priorities for the 2021 session are to lock in annual funding for Florida Forever, for land conservation through through Florida Forever, so that this doesn't become an annual budget battle. And when the Florida Forever is kind of a broad heading that includes some other land conservation programs as well, like the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, which is normally aimed at agricultural land, and the Florida Communities Trust, which is often parkland. As I mentioned before, the historic funding for Florida Forever was $300 million. We think there needs to be a funding floor. It'd be great if we set the floor at 300 million. That's not looking likely, but anyway, there needs to be a minimum established from year to year. And this is a time of historically low interest rates. So it's a great time to take advantage of the opportunity to bond funding so that we can stretch dollars as far as possible. A couple of other priorities that Haley will be talking about, and that is strengthening the water protection process that began with the Clean Waterways Act that was passed, the comprehensive or omnibus water protection legislation. We think there is a long way to go from last year. That was just the start. And some of that process is underway, but we could certainly strengthen water protection in Florida. We'd like to see more incentives to reduce water consumption, to promote water conservation. And we would love to see steps taken to free the Ocklawaha River to breach the Rodman Dam.
Paul, if I could jump in real quick.
Sure.
Haley will be talking about some of the ways to strengthen water protection, which of course is very important to the Middle Basin. But I also want to raise the importance of adopting incentives to reduce water consumption by public and private users. This is of importance to our springs. We're actually seeing a reduction of spring flow in the St. Johns River by about 30% due to overconsumption. And we're growing, so quickly in the Middle Basin. And so to make sure that we're living within our water means and incentivizing water conservation is of critical importance. So look forward to continue to work with you all in that avenue as well.
Thanks, Lisa. I would underscore everything you just said. It's right on target. All right, Shannon, let's go to the next slide. I'm just going to highlight just a few conservation bills. There are a lot more out there, but some that are particularly relevant for today's topic. First of all, I mentioned the funding floor that we would like to see for Florida Forever. There have been bills introduced in the Senate and the House to create that floor at $100 million. The Senate bill from Senator Linda Stewart of Orlando also would bar the use of those funds for administrative expenses in agencies, administrative or overhead expenses. That's been one of the problems since Amendment 1 was overwhelmingly passed in 2014. That's the constitutional amendment that reserved funding for land and water conservation. A lot of those dollars have ended up just supplanting money that used to be taken from general revenue for agency administrative expenses. That's really frustrating the intent of the 2014 amendment. So Senator Stewart's bill would try to put a stop to that. Both Senator Stewart and Representative Altman would extend the bonding authority that I talked about, so we could take advantage of low interest rate and stretch the dollars as far as possible for land acquisition. So we are supporting these bills, even though we would prefer a higher funding floor closer to the historic funding level of at least $300 million. Okay, next slide. Now there are a couple of narrower bills from Senator Broder and Representative Roth that would extend the bonding authority for Florida Forever, but they don't include the funding floor. These bills may get a little bit further, however, because the sponsors have a little more clout in Tallahassee. Senator Broder is the chair of the Environmental and Natural Resources Committee. So he's the gatekeeper on the Senate side of environmental legislation. Representative Roth is a Republican member of the Agriculture and Natural Resources Appropriations Subcommittee, which is a key committee for environmental legislation in the House. Next slide. Senator Broder also shows up on this bill, and Representative Trudeau from Lake County is the sponsor of the House counterpart. The Little Wekiva River, which is a tributary of the Wekiva, has become clogged with sediment and invasive plants on some sections. And this really troubling development has coincided with the current major reconstruction on Interstate 4, which runs nearby the Little Wekiva River. The Department of Transportation insists that it's not the culprit, but it's it's hard to see what else might be responsible for the scale of the degradation that's taken place. These bills would require a study on the sediment accumulation and water quality in the river, as well as recommendations for remediation of those problems. And an important element of the bill is that they would also require applications for development within the Wekiva River Protection Area to include a study of potential impacts to the Wekiva River. And of course, the Wekiva is a St. John's tributary, and it's one of just 2 wild and scenic rivers in Florida. So it's a precious natural asset and important in the Middle Basin in the St. John's. Meanwhile, just this week, Seminole County announced that they would be seeking grants to fund a $2 million Little Wekiva River cleanup and restoration effort.
And Paul, if I could just thank Gabby, our Middle Basin coordinator. She's had a chance to meet with residents along the Little Wekiva and take elected officials out there to see the challenges, and appreciate her work, as well as all of the waterfront neighbors out there that are having to deal with this really dire issue.
Yes, and our hope is that the study will not slow urgent attempts to address this, that the study will be done in good faith and will not be a reason to slow down action to address this urgent problem for that waterway. So that does it for my summary of conservation bills, and now it's on to Haley for the water bills.
Great. Can you all hear me? Awesome. Well, thanks for having us. Again, my name is Haley Bush, Outreach Director for 1000 Friends of Florida, and I'm going to provide a brief overview of some of the water legislation we've been following. And I welcome Lisa to chime in here because as water keepers, this is your area of expertise. So first, as you can see on the slide, I'm going to go back to 2020. If you're anything like me, 2020 seems ages ago with this past year. So I'm going to give a quick refresh on Senate Bill 712. Won't go into the nitty gritty here, but as river keepers, you are all too aware of the harmful algal blooms that plagued our state in recent years. When Governor DeSantis was campaigning, he made the harmful algal blooms, the red tide incidents, and going on across the state, he made that a campaign priority. Right when he took office, he issued an executive order on water quality reforms and funding. The Blue-Green Algae Task Force was convened and met throughout the year, culminating in a consensus document in October of 2019. And then we saw during the 2020 legislative session, Senator Mayfield's SB 712 was then made its way through session and was signed into law. And before we go to the next slide, I will say 1000 Friends of Florida, as Paul mentioned earlier, we initially supported that bill when it was first introduced, the Clean Waterways Act, right? And we urged legislators to strengthen the provisions of the bill as they moved along through the committee process. Unfortunately, as we all saw, many parts of that bill were significantly weakened or eliminated, and then we withdrew our support. So 712, it includes sections for several different types of water pollution sources. It directs DEP and DACS, the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services, to initiate regulatory rulemaking. The success of those different elements of rulemaking will really depend on the will of agencies and their ability and willingness to enforce those rules, and some of them will require additional legislative ratification. So next slide, please. So instead of diving into all parts of Senate Bill 712, I thought I would just focus on biosolids, an issue I know the Riverkeeper, St. John's Riverkeeper, has been following very closely and been really engaged in. So Senate Bill 712 directed DEP to conduct rulemaking for a second time in recent years. This second rule was published in December 2020. And according to 712, as 712 was passed, The rule was then supposed to be heard before the Environmental Regulation Commission for additional scrutiny, public opportunity for the public to weigh in again. But instead, breaking news as of yesterday, a bill was filed in this legislative session, HB 1309, filed by Representative Payne. And this bill would essentially circumvent the ERC process and go straight for legislative ratification. So unfortunately, this rule, which now would be going through the legislative process instead of the ERC process, the rule includes a considerable loophole, does not go far enough in protecting all of Florida's waters. Overall, biosolids, as many of you in the audience know, are a short-sighted solution to Florida's growing human waste problem. As our population grows, the available land, we've been talking about this, Lisa, in the past couple of days. The lands, as we grow in population, more people come to Florida, the available lands for land application of biosolids diminishes, and poop becomes even more concentrated as it flows into our waters.
And Haley, and if I could add and just underscore why this is so important to the St. Johns River, as well as the Middle Basin, is that in South Florida, it's banned. You can't dispose of this human waste on land. And the legislature actually gave South Florida the authority and the ability to raise their rates where they could truck their sewage sludge to the north. And unfortunately, the headwaters of the St. Johns are the closest place to dispose of that human waste. And so we're getting about 89,000 tons of the sewage sludge in the St. Johns River watershed. And it's not even our own sewage that we're being forced to deal with in the St. Johns River. As a result, we've seen an increase in phosphorus pollution, which is one of the two nutrients that fuel toxic blue-green algae. And as Haley mentioned, this bill does not go far enough to truly get to the root cause of the problem. We are growing. I heard a new number the other day, about 1,400 people per day. And when you're having an increased volume of people, you have an increased volume of human waste. And if it's banned in South Florida, we're going to see more of South Florida's waste, as well as an increase here threatening our waterways. So we need to really get a comprehensive plan to sustainably deal with our growing amount of human waste. And this bill falls short of doing that, and it still forces us to absorb waste from South Florida.
And we look forward to working with you and other water keepers on a strategy on this issue. So thank you. Next, the slide. We're now on another bill filed just this last week. It was filed by Senator Stewart from the Orlando area and Representative Goff Marcil. So it's Senate Bill 1522 and House Bill 1225. So this bill takes elements from the Blue-Green Algae Task Force 2019 report, takes elements of that report that were not implemented in Senate Bill 712, and it would build upon the legislation passed last year. So a couple examples of how it would do that. For Basin Management Action Plans, BMAPs, it would require a better assessment of population change and the impacts on water bodies, including alterations in land use and altered hydrology. The bill also includes better tracking of agricultural fertilizer applications. It includes a stronger justification of the benefits of agricultural BMPs, the best management practices, and an estimate of nutrient input and load reduction associated with those BMP adoption. It includes a septic tank inspection and monitoring program, requiring inspections at least once every 5 years with a 10-year implementation plan. So it would provide 10 years for municipalities to come into compliance with that program. The bill also requires the development of stormwater inspection and monitoring by a date by January of 2022. And my reading of that is perhaps adding a deadline to the DEP's ongoing rulemaking. Rulemaking is occurring at this time. And the bill 712 did not include a deadline for when that rulemaking was supposed to concur. So this bill, these two bills have not been referred to committee as of this morning. They were just filed this week. This is one we will be watching closely. I will say, as Paul kind of mentioned earlier, these are two Democrat legislators. So in order for this bill to move along, it will need the support of leadership in the committees or Republican leadership in either chamber. Next slide, please. So this bill is Senate Bill 64, Reclaimed Water by Senator Albritton and Representative Randy Maggard. This bill essentially couples a requirement to reduce wastewater discharges into water bodies, couples it with the requirement of reclassifying reclaimed water for potable reuse and include it as an alternative source for drinking water. So the first part of this bill is nice, reducing those non-beneficial discharges into water bodies. That's good. But the potable reuse element is cause for concern. The need to find alternative water sources for public consumption comes as we continue to grow and develop and deplete our current freshwater sources, as Lisa and Paul were alluding to earlier. Potable reuse, which is also known as toilet to tap, could potentially be a viable source someday, but there's still so many unknowns about how we get some of the harmful chemicals out of our water. And this bill, our main concern with it is it gets around the bigger issue about our water consumption as a state. We need to be prioritizing water conservation, alternate and costly technologies such as potable reuse or even desalination. Those technologies should be secondary in our opinion, and instead be making smarter development decisions, addressing the biggest water users first. And more compact development measures would certainly have an impact and help save a significant amount of water. If you want to chime in here on that issue, Lisa, but that is our overall concern with this bill. We haven't taken a position on it just yet. We likely will in the coming weeks. The bill passed the Senate side, passed its first committee stop now. So it is moving. It's now in community affairs, but the House bill has not yet had a committee stop.
Yeah, and I would just add, this is another one of those these issues that there's things that need to be addressed that this bill is silent on. One, with the increased use of reclaimed water as irrigation, which is a good thing, right? It offsets putting drinking water on our grass. But if it's not regulated and done well, it can actually increase nutrient pollution runoff into our waterways. Same, we have some concerns about putting gray water or wastewater into the aquifer for aquifer storage. Yes, could be a safe way, but I think those protections aren't fully understood. There's conduits within our aquifer in ways that things are connected that we may not know about. So there's some risks that haven't been addressed, and they're silent on this bill. And it not only puts our drinking water at risk, it puts our springs at risk. So it's of importance to make sure if this is happening, we're not moving one pollution problem to another area, and we're not taking a point source or a pipe, that's more controlled, and then spreading it out to a non-point source where it's harder to control the pollution. And so those are things that need to be addressed from a more holistic standpoint.
Absolutely, and that's where strong statewide planning, regional planning comes in as well. So we're a lot of overlap there in our priorities. That's my last slide. I'll just wrap up my part of the presentation here. So those are the main water related bills that we are following this year. We're tracking a couple more. You can see them on our website, on our legislative tracker. Jane will walk you through that in a minute. But when we withdrew our support for Senate Bill 712 last year, as Paul mentioned, we were hopeful that that would be the beginning of stronger water quality protections under Governor DeSantis's term. While COVID-19 certainly may have diverted, and rightfully so, some of our attention away from the water quality issues, we know as environmental advocates that water quality issues, water woes are not a new issue. They weren't new in 2018, 2019. It's been a decades-long problem. And to spin that in a positive light, there is some hope in some of these bills. And we're looking for improvements this year to build upon Senate Bill 712. So with that, thank you for your attention. And I'll turn it back over to Shannon and Lisa.
Thank you, Haley. And I think next up, we're going to have Jane walk you all through Thousand Friends website that can demonstrate how you too can benefit from their very detailed oversight of what's happening in Tallahassee. So Jane, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Again, can everyone see our legislative session page? Great. So if you go to the 1000 Friends of Florida website and you click on our priorities and then go down to the 2021 legislative session, this is the page that is going to pop up. And we have our legislative priorities outlined here. So you can take a look at that. What would be really helpful if this is important to you, and I'm sure it is because you're attending this webinar, but sign up for getting email alerts. And that way you'll be notified, and I'll scroll down here so you can see when we have a bill that requires attention for you to contact your lawmakers. We put it in the action needed section, and you'll get a quick email blast on that. And that way you'll have the information necessary to contact your lawmakers, and we include talking points for you as well. It's a really helpful resource to have. And so with each of these bills, you can see we provide a lot of context there. There's always the bill sponsor, and you can take a look at, what the RPCs do, why it's important. And I went over this earlier, so I won't dive into that one. But if you continue scrolling down, you'll see all of our growth management bills, and quite a few this legislative session. You can see that I only touched on a handful during my presentation. There are so many bills, as Paul mentioned. And here are our transportation bills, our conservation bills, and our water bills that we're monitoring. So I would strongly encourage you. This is, I have to say, an amazing resource. Even before I joined 1000 Friends of Florida in 2019, this is the go-to, not only for people in growth management and land use, but across the state. People use this resource. It gets updated on a daily basis. And then when we head into session, it sometimes gets updated on an hourly basis because things are moving so quickly. So I would strongly encourage you to check out the website and sign up for our email alerts and be engaged citizens. That is the only way this is all going to work, is if the lawmakers hear from their constituents on what your priorities are. So with that, I'm gonna wrap up and stop the share. And it's back to you, Lisa and Shannon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. And I do want to underscore what Jane just said, is that it truly takes citizens to engage. In 2020, environmental organizations across the state came together to really raise and sound the alarm on Senate Bill 712. In fact, Sierra Club, Florida Springs Council, and Waterkeepers Florida, we submitted 18 amendments to Senate Bill 712, trying to truly give it some opportunity to make a difference and to protect our waterways. And unfortunately, we couldn't get them heard. And so that's why we need you. We need citizens to engage because it's going to take environmental groups like 1000 Friends of Florida, St. John's Riverkeeper, Florida Springs Councils, and others. But citizens are what really drive it and give us that energy and backstop and get their representatives' ears. So we're going to continue to work this session, as well as continue to work on water policies through the rulemaking that Haley had mentioned, strategically working together. But we need you all to take action, and we really appreciate you being here today to engage, and also sharing this with your friends. We will have this where you can share this recording and take action on these resources. But now we want to open up the floor to you all for questions. You can type questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we will, I think Shannon Blankenship, our advocacy director, will be able to let you ask your question. But let's open up the floor and see if there's any questions out there. Shannon?
Lisa, while we wait and see if anyone raises their hand, we did have some that were pre-submitted. And I think that both Paul and Haley had commented on this earlier, but I was hoping you guys could speak to what legislation this year, if any, will help fund septic to sewer conversions, and whether that will go straight to municipalities or be available for individuals. And I'll let whoever you think is best answer that. Go ahead and start.
Yeah, I think I'm going to kick that to Paul. Paul?
Yeah, in the list of budget items on my budget slide, I mentioned that Governor DeSantis had proposed $100 million for grants So these would be to, I believe, to municipalities rather than to individuals to fund, among other things, septic to sewer conversions. Now, there is also flexibility in there. It could be used for wastewater treatment upgrades or for stormwater system upgrades. So there is some money there. $100 million sounds like a lot of money, but when you spread it over the entire state, when you include the fact that it's not only septic to sewer conversions, but it's also those other purposes that I mentioned, that's not a whole lot of money for the extent of the problem in Florida. There are 2.7 million septic tanks in Florida. Quite a few of them are probably leaching nutrients into the water supply and aggravating the problems we've seen in our waterways with algal blooms. So it's a big problem. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem. We're going to need to invest more than the governor has proposed. What he's proposed is a start, and it's certainly good to have that start, but there needs to be more funding for that. There are also Haley mentioned the bill that would bring in some of the recommendations from the Blue-Green Algae Task Force that were not implemented by the legislature. One of those was the septic tank inspection program. We actually had a septic tank inspection program that was passed in 2010. And before it had a chance to actually get started, it was repealed by the legislature in 2012. So that's another important part of dealing with pollution from septic tanks in Florida, is having some kind of regular system of inspecting them and making sure that they are not leaking and worsening pollution in nearby waterways.
Yeah, totally agree with you. That inspection program is important. We did receive another pre-question before the workshop asking about grants for septic tank phase out or hookups within the Blue Springs area. Gabby dropped in the chat a contact, Mike Ulrich, I believe is his last name. He's the Director of Utilities in Volusia County, and his email is in the chat to see if that's for that question. Shannon, I think I saw Harmony with the hand raised.
Yeah, Harmony, go ahead. Hopefully you can unmute yourself. I hope so. And go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, thank you so much for hosting these meetings. I love becoming informed about the very important issues regarding our water. So my question is, it sounds like there are several other factors at play as far as the levels of the springs. I was just wondering if Nestle has any impact on the effect of the levels in the springs regarding their contract with Ginny Springs and potentially other springs as well.
That's a great question. And we are opposed to that permit. And I believe we may have someone from Florida Springs Council. Is there someone on from Florida Springs Council? If not, I know that they're hard at work to reviewing legal actions on that permit. Because when you have those major withdrawals, I mean, they definitely impact spring levels. And when you have these major withdrawals approved in areas of springs that are already below what they should be, it's insult to injury. So that's something that, it needs to be addressed. And fortunately, there is a fantastic coalition with Santa Fe, I'm forgetting their name. Help me, Shannon. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Santa Fe?
Yes.
Save our Santa Fe River.
as well as Florida Springs Council addressing that issue, and specifically with Nestle. And we do have bottling, there's permits, across the state. And one of the issues right now is people don't pay for our water. There's permits handed out for beer manufacturers, for bottled water, for all agriculture, for all these things, and no one pays for the water. And so we have a dwindling resource. We know we've over-tapped our aquifer, and at the same time we're giving our water away for free. They only have to pay for the infrastructure. So it's something that needs to be addressed, again, holistically. Just recently I was at a group luncheon and someone said, what is the carrying capacity of the state of Florida? And carrying capacity means, what can our state support realistically with land and water, but still protect our natural resources sustainably for future generations? And we've asked that question. I'm sure 1,000 Friends has asked that question. And the elected community, they don't want to answer that, because that means there would have to be these limits and these protections. But I think that's an extremely important question to have. What can our aquifer sustain, as well as our land, and everything we have that makes Florida great? And I think if we had that carrying capacity, you wouldn't see permits like Nestle approved like it was just this past week.
I'll chime in too. I know an element from Senate Bill 712, many things were struck out of that as it moved through session, but one of the things that remained was a study. Studies, are studies. They don't necessarily have to result in much, but there was a study for, I believe it was water management districts and DEP would need to conduct a study of the impacts of water bottling on springs. I don't remember the exact, I think it was across Florida. I don't think it was just springs. So that study, that report is supposed to be wrapped up by June of this year, June 2021. So that'd be an interesting report to look into. I haven't heard anything about the results of that study. Is it even happening? So that's something to remember, to put on our calendars to check in with DEP on.
And I wanted to chime in just quickly on the concept that Lisa mentioned of the carrying capacity. One of the reasons why we so strongly promote growth management at 1,000 Friends is if we direct the growth that we have toward urban areas and away from natural lands, but toward urban areas that have infrastructure in place to accommodate it, we're really going to reduce the negative impact on our natural lands and our waterways. So that's why it's one of the reasons why it's so important to manage growth carefully in Florida, because the less we do, the worse environmental impact we're going to experience.
Thank you, Paul. And I think we have time for one more question. Shannon, is there anyone with a hand raised or any questions in the chat?
I don't see any more from participants in the chat today, but we did have a question that was submitted, Lisa, asking about the function of the dams on Lake Griffin. And we didn't really cover a lot besides we mentioned Free the Ocklawaha when it comes to dam issues in Central Florida, but maybe if you could speak to the Lake Griffin dams for Carol.
Sure. And thank you for that question, Carol. So Lake Griffin is one of the Harris chain of lakes just north of Orlando, the headwaters of the Ocklawaha River. And it is controlled by 2 dams. And so those dams are in place they control the levels of the lake and also provide flood control. So that's in that area. There is another dam further downstream on the Ocklawaha, which is the Rodman Dam, which is an obsolete dam that serves no purpose. It was built as part of the failed Cross Florida Barge Canal. And we and 1,000 Friends and 40 other groups are part of the coalition that are looking to free the Ocklawaha, as Paul mentioned, to restore the natural connection of Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha, and the St. John's by breaching that dam and restoring the historic channel. So the ones at Lake Griffin provide flood control. The Rodman Dam is obsolete. And we believe that there's a huge economic lift as well as environmental lift by restoration and freeing the Ocklawaha for the Great Florida Riverway. But for Lake Griffin, but thank you for that question. And it reminds me, I haven't been down to the Harris Chain of Lakes in a while and would like to get out on the water down in your area soon. But thanks for that question, Carol. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Gabby to talk about some exciting things coming up in the Middle Basin that we'd like to invite you to. Gabby? Gabby, you're on mute.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm the Outreach and Education coordinator for the Middle Basin, and thanks so much for tuning in today. And I have some activities to participate in Orange, Volusia, Seminole Lake, and parts of Marion County. And our population is almost about 2.5 million and growing daily. The first activity I wanted to tell you about was enables you to get outside and clean up the Blackwater Creek. And Blackwater Creek is a tributary to the St. Johns River, and it is one of the only designated wild and scenic areas in this part of the state. And we're going to be cleaning up 3 bridges that cross different roadways. And the river itself, it'll be Saturday, March 6th, and we'll be meeting volunteers at the Lake Norris Conservation Trailhead, and you can go online here and get directions and find out, and it will be doing about 3 hours of fun. And recently I paddled out on the Blackwater Creek when the water levels were high, and I actually ran into a very large old-fashioned TV set that somebody had dumped over the bridge and dragged it back, and it was quite a challenge. So hopefully we won't find too many TV sets out there. And the host of this event is Ashley Coonan, who is our river ambassador for the Wild and Scenic River program, and also one of our state forest rangers, Mike Martin. And this is an annual event that's been done for probably 10 years or more. And the Blackwater Creek flows totally through acquired natural lands that are owned by the state of Florida. So I hope to see you out there, and you can check out the website, and please dress accordingly with closed-toed shoes and prepare to get wet and enjoy the outdoors. So on March 11, I have the honor of interviewing environmental journalist Amy Green. I'm very excited. She's our local NPR television and radio broadcaster and journalist, and she just came out with a new book, Moving Waters. It should be released very soon, and we're going to be doing the Orange County League of Women Voters Hot Topics luncheon on March 10th, and I'm sorry, it's March 11th. Wait, I'll verify that. March 10th. Amy Green is an award-winning journalist, and she also has a wonderful podcast on the Everglades that you can look up called Drained, and it has several parts to that. So check out the League of Women Voters website and sign up, or you'll be able to find hopefully a link on our St. Johns Riverkeeper website. And also, I'm going to be doing a Zoom presentation for the Volusia County Water Alliance that we don't have a day yet, but I did a 10-day kayak challenge, and I'm going to be talking about the impacts of septic tanks and sewer discharges and fertilizers as well. So I hope you can come out. And please remember that water is life, and we deserve swimmable and fishable St. Johns River and for the river. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. And if you can catch her talk, I've heard great things about a preview she gave about her 10-day kayak challenge recently. And if you can get out on the water with Gabby and us, then that's even better. But thank you all for coming today. I want to thank Thousand Friends for their tireless work during the legislative session and preparing for it. The session begins next week, so please use their tools to engage. At their website, you can also find these events as well as call to action specifically for the St. John's at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. And we look forward to continue to partner together for the river and for Florida water. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great weekend, and get out and enjoy this great water on the St. John's. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much.